I remember the exact sound my father's glass made when it touched the table, just a little too hard, just enough to make everyone look up. He was smiling when he called me his biggest mistake. Not angry, not even cruel in the way people expect. Just certain. Some things he said, lifting his chin toward the investors you learn to let go of. There were a few polite chuckles around the room. People always laughed when he spoke like that. He had built a life out of saying things others were too careful to say. I sat at the far end of the long conference table, hands folded loosely in my lap, the way I used to sit in waiting rooms at the VA hospital. Still, quiet, not drawing attention. No one in that room thought I belonged there. Which was exactly how I'd planned it. The contract slid across the polished wood a moment later. Thick, clean, tabbed with colored flags. The final version of a deal my father had been chasing for almost 3 years, a $1.4 billion logistics expansion that would stretch his company from regional to national overnight. He didn't look at me when he pushed it forward. He didn't need to. "Let's finish this," he said. The lawyer across from him, gray suit, narrow tie, a man who had probably closed more deals than I had attended family dinners, reached for the document. He adjusted his glasses, scanned the first page, then the second. And then he stopped. It wasn't dramatic, no sudden movement, no raised voice. Just stillness. I recognized it. I'd seen it before. In operating rooms. In supply meetings when someone realized a number didn't line up. In those quiet seconds before a problem revealed itself. The lawyer's eyes moved again, slower this time. He turned one page back, then forward. "Sir," he said, not looking up yet, "we need to stop." The room shifted. My father's smile didn't disappear, but it changed, tightened. Stop what? The lawyer finally looked up, not at him. At me. "Before we proceed," he said carefully, "I need clarification on one of the listed entities." No one spoke. Chairs creaked softly. Someone coughed. I kept my hands where they were, calm, resting. My father followed the lawyer's gaze, and for the first time since I walked into that room, he really looked at me. Not through me, not past me, at me. It felt unfamiliar. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his voice steady, but I could hear the edge under it. I'd grown up listening for that edge. The lawyer hesitated just a fraction. "I believe there may be a conflict of interest that hasn't been disclosed." That word conflict hung in the air like something fragile. My father leaned back slightly in his chair. "Then disclose it." The lawyer inhaled. "One of the holding entities involved in this deal appears to be connected to..." He stopped again, because now he was certain. And so was I. "Connected to Ms. Carter," he finished. Silence. I didn't move, didn't rush to explain. I'd learned a long time ago that the first person to fill silence usually lost control of the room. My father didn't speak right away either. He just stared at me as if waiting for me to correct it, to laugh, to shake my head and say there had been a mistake. I didn't. "Emily," he said finally. He hadn't said my name like that in years, not in a room full of people. "Yes," I answered, my voice even. The lawyer cleared his throat. "Sir, based on the documentation, Ms. Carter appears to be the registered beneficiary of a significant portion of the equity structure tied to this agreement." Someone shifted sharply in their seat. Papers rustled. A pen dropped. My father's expression didn't crack. That was something he'd taught me whether he meant to or not. You never gave a room your reaction before you understood the situation. "How significant?" he asked. The lawyer didn't answer immediately. He flipped one more page, then set the document down very carefully. "Enough," he said, "that we need to pause this meeting and review the implications before moving forward." There it was again. Pause. My father's eyes stayed on mine, searching now, calculating. I held his gaze. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. And then quietly, almost as if he were asking a question he wasn't sure he wanted answered, he said, "When did you do this?" Not why. Not how. When. I let out a slow breath. "That depends," I said, "on when you stopped paying attention." A few people looked down at the table. No one wanted to be caught watching. My father didn't react to the words, but something in his shoulders shifted just slightly, the way it used to when he realized he'd underestimated someone. It had taken him a long time to see me at all. "I think," the lawyer said gently, trying to reclaim some control of the situation, "it would be best if we took a short recess." No one argued. Chairs pushed back, phones appeared in hands, conversations broke into low, careful murmurs. My father didn't stand. Neither did I. We sat there across from each other, the distance between us measured not in feet but in years. I hadn't always been the person sitting quietly at the end of his table. There was a time when I would have spoken first, explained everything, tried to make it make sense to him. But that was before I learned something the hard way. Being understood isn't the same as being heard. And being heard doesn't mean anything if the person listening has already decided who you are. I folded my hands again the same way I used to in those long VA hospital corridors, waiting for procurement approvals that never came on time, listening to veterans talk about things they carried for decades because no one had asked the right questions. That's where I learned to pay attention. Not to what people said, but to what they missed. My father had missed a lot. He'd missed the nights I sat beside my mother's hospital bed learning how systems failed people who depended on them. He'd missed the calls I didn't make, the ones where I could have asked him for help and didn't. He'd missed the way I stopped trying to prove myself to him and started building something he wouldn't see. Not because I wanted to hide, but because I needed it to be mine. The room slowly emptied around us, but neither of us moved. Finally, my father pushed his chair back just enough to stand. He didn't look away as he did. "This isn't over," he said. "No," I replied, "it isn't." He nodded once, not agreement, not approval. Just acknowledgement. Then he turned and walked toward the door, people parting slightly to let him pass. I stayed where I was. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was sitting at his table. It felt like we were finally sitting at the same one. And it had taken a $1.4 billion deal for him to notice. I didn't follow him out right away. Instead, I stayed seated a few minutes longer, letting the room clear the way it always does after something unexpected, slowly, carefully, like people aren't quite sure where to look. A few investors nodded politely as they passed me. One man gave me a longer look, the kind that tries to place a face in a memory that doesn't exist. I gave nothing back, just a small, neutral smile. Old habits. By the time I stood, the room was quiet again. The contract still lay open on the table, pages slightly shifted where the lawyer had paused. I walked over and straightened the stack, aligning the edges the way I used to do with supply forms at the VA. Details matter when everything else feels uncertain. Especially then. Out in the hallway, the tone had already changed. Voices were low-controlled. No one was laughing anymore. Phones were pressed to ears, words like delay review and structure floating in clipped conversations. My father stood near the windows at the far end, looking out over the city like he always did when he needed to think. Hands behind his back, shoulders squared. The same posture he'd held since I was a child, watching him from the staircase when he didn't know I was there. He didn't turn when I approached. "You picked a strange way to get my attention," he said. I stopped a few feet away. "I didn't do it for your attention." That got a small reaction. Not much, just enough. Then what he asked. "For the deal," I said. "And what comes after it?" He let that sit between us. "You expect me to believe that," he said after a moment. "I expect you to read the documents," I replied. That almost sounded like something he would have said. He turned, then slowly studying me in a way that felt different from before. Not dismissive, not impatient, just unfamiliar. "You've been out of my business for years," he said, "working in hospitals, government contracts, small numbers." "Numbers aren't small if they affect the right people," I said. His mouth tightened slightly. "You always did prefer theory over reality." I almost smiled at that. Because he was wrong. But I understood why he thought that. "You never asked what I was actually doing," I said. "I didn't need to," he answered. "You left." That was true. But it wasn't the whole truth. "I didn't leave," I said quietly. "I stepped out of your way." He held my gaze for a long moment, weighing the words. My father had built his life on reading people, on knowing when someone was bluffing, when they were stalling, when they were holding something back. He wasn't used to not having the full picture. "Explain it," he said finally. "Not a demand, not quite. But close." I leaned against the wall, keeping a little distance between us. Close enough to speak quietly, far enough to stay steady. "You remember when Mom got sick?" I said. He didn't answer, but his expression shifted just slightly, which was answer enough. "She was in that VA hospital for almost 8 months," I continued. "Different wings, different specialists, same problems." "Emily," he started. Just listen, I said, not raising my voice. He stopped. There were delays in supplies, I said. Basic things. Equipment that should have been there wasn't. Orders sat in the system because one department didn't talk to another. People worked hard, but the structure didn't support them. He watched me quieter now. I started paying attention, I went on. At first because of her, then because I realized it wasn't just one hospital. It was everywhere. And that led you to what he asked. Procurement, I said. Logistics, contracts. The part of the system no one notices until it fails. He exhaled slowly. You traded this, he gestured vaguely toward the conference room for paperwork and supply chains. I traded noise for clarity, I said. That landed differently. He didn't dismiss it this time. I built relationships, I continued. Regional suppliers, transport networks, small operators who actually deliver on time because they can't afford not to. People you don't see because they're not big enough for your deals. His eyes narrowed slightly. And you think they can support something like this? They already do, I said. You just don't know their names. Silence again. This one felt heavier. Because now he wasn't just listening. He was reconsidering. You still haven't explained the structure, he said. No, I agreed, I haven't. I straightened slightly, folding my hands again without thinking. Another old habit. You were expanding too fast, I said, taking on risk without enough flexibility in your supply chain. It looked strong from the outside, but it wasn't built to hold long term. His jaw set. I've been doing this longer than you've been alive. I know, I said. That's why I didn't argue with you. That surprised him. I worked around you instead, I added. There it was. The part that mattered. You positioned yourself inside my deal, he said slowly. Yes. Without telling me. Yes. And you expect me to accept that as, what help? I didn't answer right away. Because this was the part that didn't fit neatly into his world. It wasn't about what you'd accept, I said finally. It was about what the deal needed. His eyes searched mine again, sharper now. You made that decision for me. I made it for the outcome, I said. Another silence. This one stretched longer. Because now we were somewhere neither of us had been before. Not arguing. Not avoiding. Just standing in the middle of something that had been building for years. You always thought I didn't see you, he said quietly. I didn't respond. Because that wasn't the question anymore. And now, he continued, I'm supposed to believe you've been watching everything I do. I didn't need to watch everything I said, just the parts that mattered. He let out a breath that almost sounded like a laugh, but wasn't. You really believe that, he said. I do. He nodded once slowly. Not agreement. Not yet. But something closer to recognition. And for the first time I saw it. Not the man who had called me a mistake, but the one who was starting to realize he might have been wrong. He didn't say anything else after that. Not right away. We stood there in the hallway a little longer, the kind of silence that doesn't need to be filled because both people are already thinking too much. Then someone called his name from down the corridor, one of the investors, and the moment shifted. He gave me one last look, not quite finished, then turned and walked toward them. I didn't follow. I stepped outside instead. The air felt different out there, quieter, cooler. The city moved the same way it always had, cars easing through intersections, people walking with purpose, conversations I couldn't hear, but none of it touched what had just happened upstairs. That's something I learned a long time ago. Big moments don't stop the world. They just change yours. I stood there for a minute, then another, letting my shoulders settle. I'd been holding them tight without realizing it. Old habit again. When you spend enough time in hospitals, you learn to wait without moving. That's where it started, really. Not in boardrooms. Not in contracts. In a long hallway at the VA hospital years ago where the floors always smelled faintly of antiseptic and coffee, and the chairs were just uncomfortable enough to remind you not to stay too long even when you had no choice. My mother was in room 314. It wasn't the worst room in the building, but it wasn't the best either. Somewhere in the middle, which felt fitting for how things had been going. Not terrible. Not good. Just uncertain. I used to sit beside her bed in the afternoons when the light came through the window at an angle that made everything look softer than it was. She'd sleep sometimes. Other times she'd talk not about being sick, but about small things. Grocery lists, old neighbors. Things that made the room feel less like a place you waited in. My father came when he could. That's how people described it. He came when he could. It sounded reasonable, responsible even. But what it meant was this. He came between meetings. He stayed on his phone. He stood at the foot of the bed more than he sat beside it. He wasn't unkind. He was just elsewhere. One afternoon, a nurse came in looking for a delivery that hadn't arrived, a piece of equipment that was supposed to be there that morning. She checked the chart, made a call, waited on hold, then apologized like it was her fault. "It'll be here soon," she said. But her voice didn't sound sure. I watched that happen more than once. Different items, same pattern. Delays. Confusion. People doing their best inside a system that didn't quite hold together. I started asking questions. Not loudly, not in a way that drew attention, just small things. Who orders this? Where does it come from? Why is it late? Most people didn't have clear answers. But a few did. And those were the ones I paid attention to. There was a man named Walter who worked in procurement. Late 60s, always wore the same brown jacket, even indoors. He had a way of explaining things that made them sound simpler than they were. "It's not that things don't exist," he told me once, leaning back in his chair. "It's that they don't move the way they're supposed to." "Why not?" I asked. He shrugged. Too many layers, too many hands, no one responsible when something slips. That stayed with me. Because I'd grown up in a world where my father always knew who was responsible. He built his business on that idea. Clear lines, clear control. But here in this place, control didn't look the same. Things slipped. And people paid for it. After my mother passed, I didn't go home right away. I stayed. At first, just to help with small things. Paperwork, calls, following up on orders that were already late. Then more. Walter started letting me sit in on meetings, not official ones, the kind where people spoke honestly because no one important was in the room. "You listen better than most," he said once. "That's rare." I didn't think of it as a skill back then. Just something I did. But listening turned into understanding, and understanding turned into work. I took a position in procurement a few months later. My father didn't approve. "You don't need a job like that," he told me over dinner one night. "If you want to work, there are better places to do it." Better for who, I asked. He didn't answer directly. "For you," he said instead. But I stayed. Because for the first time I felt like what I did mattered in a way I could measure. Not in headlines, not in numbers printed in reports. In whether something arrived on time. In whether someone got what they needed when they needed it. It wasn't impressive. It wasn't visible. But it was real. Years passed like that. I learned the patterns, the gaps, the places where systems broke under pressure. I learned which suppliers delivered and which ones didn't, which contracts looked strong but weren't, which partnerships held when things got complicated. And slowly, without meaning to at first, I started building connections outside the hospital. Small companies, regional distributors, people who didn't show up on the kind of lists my father used. They remembered me. Because I remembered them. That's how it works in quieter parts of the world. You build trust one delivery at a time. One problem solved. One promise kept. I didn't think of it as building something. Not then. It was just work. Useful work. But eventually those connections started to overlap with something else. Something bigger. My father's name came up in conversations more often, not directly. Not in ways that would have caught his attention. But enough. He was expanding, moving into areas that required the kind of networks I understood better than he did. At first I ignored it. It wasn't my business. I'd made that clear to him, and he'd made it clear to me. We were separate. Or at least that's what I believed. Until one afternoon, sitting in a small office with a supplier who had just lost a contract he couldn't afford to lose, I saw it. Not a mistake. A pattern. And patterns, once you see them, are hard to ignore. That was the first moment I realized something important. I wasn't outside his world. I was just standing in a part of it he couldn't see. The first time I saw the deal on paper, it didn't look dangerous. That's what I remember most. It looked clean, structured. The kind of thing my father had been building toward for years, layered entities, staggered financing, regional consolidation, under a single operational umbrella. On the surface, it made sense. It was only when I started tracing the supply routes underneath that something felt off. Not wrong. Just stretched. I was sitting in Walter's old office when it came together. He had retired by then, though he still stopped by every couple of weeks to check in, bring coffee, and pretend he wasn't missed. His chair was still there, his notes still tucked into folders no one else understood. I had one of those folders open in front of me. A map of distribution routes across 3 states, delivery times, backup suppliers, contract notes scribbled in the margins in his careful handwriting. I laid that beside the summary I'd gotten from one of the regional partners tied indirectly to my father's expansion. The timelines didn't match. Not in a way that would show up in a presentation, but in a way that would matter when things got tight. "You see it yet?" Walter asked from the doorway. I hadn't heard him come in. "Maybe," I said. He walked over slowly, setting his coffee down beside my papers. "Tell me what you think." I pointed to the routes. These suppliers can't handle the volume they're projecting, not without adding another layer, and if they add another layer, they lose time. And if they lose time, they miss windows, I said, which pushes everything else back. Walter nodded. "And what happens when everything else gets pushed back?" I leaned back in the chair, looking at both sets of documents again. "The whole thing still works," I said slowly, "just not the way they think it will." "That's the problem with big plans," he said. "They assume the small parts will behave." I sat with that for a moment, because I knew who had built those assumptions. My father. He didn't ignore details, he just trusted structure to carry them. And most of the time it did. But not always. "What would you do?" Walter asked. I didn't answer right away, because the obvious answer, the one that would have been easiest, was to step back. Let the deal move forward. Let the problems reveal themselves when they had to. That's what most people would have done. It wasn't my company. It wasn't my responsibility. And after everything between us, I had no reason to step in. But that's not what I did. "I'd reinforce the base," I said finally, quietly, before anything starts to slip. Walter watched me for a long moment, without telling them. I met his eyes. Would they listen if I did? He didn't answer. He didn't need to. That was when the decision really started. Not all at once, not with some big moment. Just a shift. From watching to acting. I didn't approach my father. I didn't call, didn't send a message, didn't ask for a meeting. Instead, I started with the parts I understood. The smaller operators, the regional networks, the suppliers who had been overlooked because they didn't fit into large-scale projections. I reached out carefully. Not as his daughter. Not even under my own name at first. Just as someone who knew what questions to ask. "What would it take to scale?" I asked one distributor in Ohio. "Depends who's asking," he said. "Someone who wants consistency," I replied. That got his attention. Conversations like that built slowly. One connection leading to another, one contract leading to a revised one. Small adjustments that didn't draw notice individually but started to change the shape of things when you stepped back. I wasn't trying to take over the deal. That's what it might have looked like from the outside. But that wasn't the intention. I was building support under it. A framework that could hold when pressure came. The kind of structure that doesn't show up in presentations, but determines whether something lasts. It took months, longer than I expected. There were moments I almost stopped. Moments when it felt like I was crossing a line I couldn't come back from. Because I knew what this would look like if it ever came to light. Not help. Not support. Control. And maybe that's what it was in a way. But I kept going. Because every time I reviewed the numbers again, every time I mapped the routes and timelines, I saw the same thing. It would work. Until it didn't. And when it didn't, it wouldn't fail all at once. It would slip. Gradually. Quietly. Until there was nothing left to catch it. That's what I couldn't ignore. So I made another decision. The one that mattered most. I stopped working around the deal. And stepped into it. Not publicly. Not in any way that would draw attention. I worked through layered entities, legal structures that connected without being obvious, partnerships that looked independent but aligned beneath the surface. It wasn't something I had planned from the beginning. But once I saw the path, I followed it. Carefully. Deliberately. By the time the final version of the deal was being prepared, I was already part of it. Not visible. Not acknowledged. but present. A silent partner. I didn't tell anyone. Not Walter. Not the people I worked with day to day. And certainly not my father. There were moments I thought about it. About walking into his office, laying everything out and saying, "This is what I've been doing." But every version of that conversation ended the same way. He wouldn't believe me. Or worse, he would dismiss it before understanding it. And I couldn't risk that. Not after everything that had gone into building it. So I stayed quiet. Let the structure speak for itself. Let the work hold where words wouldn't. From the outside, nothing changed. My father moved forward with the deal confident as ever. The investors signed on. The projections held. Everything looked exactly as it should. Except it wasn't exactly what it seemed. And the one thing no one in that room understood, not yet, was that the deal they were about to finalize had already changed. They just hadn't seen how. I didn't sleep much the night before the signing. Not because I was worried about being discovered. That part by then had already been decided. If it came out, it came out. I'd structured everything carefully, but there are no guarantees in work like that. Too many variables. Too many people. No, what kept me awake was something quieter. A question I'd been avoiding for months. Why I hadn't told him. Not whether I should have. That answer had always been clear in my mind. But why I had chosen this way instead. I sat at my kitchen table that night with a stack of documents and a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, reading through the final numbers again. Everything aligned. The reinforcements were in place. The supply chain was stronger than it had any right to be given how quickly the deal had come together. It would hold. That wasn't the issue anymore. The issue was what it meant. Because stepping into the deal the way I had quietly, without disclosure through layered structures, wasn't just strategy. It was a choice. And not a clean one. I had taken control of something that wasn't mine. Or at least not mine in the way my father understood ownership. He believed in direct lines, clear authority. If you built it, you owned it. If you led it, you stood at the front of it. What I had done didn't fit that model. I had stepped in underneath. Not to replace him, but to shape the outcome. And I hadn't asked. I leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes for a moment. The apartment was quiet. Too quiet sometimes. I'd gotten used to it over the years, but nights like that reminded me of how different it was from the house I grew up in. Large, always full of movement voices echoing from one room to another, even when no one was really talking to each other. We had never been a loud family, but we had never been close either. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the street below. A couple walked past, moving slowly, their steps in sync in a way that only comes from years of walking side by side. I thought about my mother. She had understood things about my father that I never quite did when I was younger. Not because she excused him, but because she saw him clearly. He doesn't ignore you on purpose, she told me once, years before she got sick. He just doesn't know how to look at something that doesn't move the way he expects. At the time, I didn't understand what she meant. I do now. Because I had done the same thing. Just in a different direction. I had stopped trying to move the way he expected. And instead of explaining it, I had built something he couldn't see. Not because I wanted to hide, but because I believed it was the only way it would survive. That's the part I hadn't wanted to admit. This wasn't just about protecting the deal. It was about protecting it from him. I went back to the table and sat down again, pulling one of the folders closer. The entity structure was laid out, clearly layers of partnerships, holding companies' contractual links that tied everything together without making it obvious. At the center of it was a name that wouldn't mean anything to him. Not at first. Emily Carter. Not his daughter. Not in the way he thought of me. Just a name on paper. That had been intentional. I told myself it was practical, cleaner, less complicated. But there was something else there, too. Distance. If he didn't see me in it, he couldn't dismiss it as easily. If he didn't connect it to me, he might actually evaluate it on its own merits. That had been the reasoning. At least that's what I told myself. But as I sat there looking at the documents again, I realized something else. I hadn't just been avoiding his judgment. I had been avoiding the possibility that he might never change it. That even if he knew, even if he understood everything I had built, he would still look at me and see the same thing he always had. The mistake. That thought settled heavier than I expected. Because for all the distance I had created, for all the independence I had built, there was still a part of me that wanted something simple. To be seen. Not as an extension of him. Not as a disappointment. Just as capable. I closed the folder slowly. That wasn't a business problem. It was something else. And it didn't have a clean solution. The next morning, everything moved the way it was supposed to. The meeting was scheduled. The documents were finalized. The investors arrived on time, each one carrying their own expectations into the room. My father was in his element. Confident, controlled, certain of the outcome. He greeted people by name, remembered details about their past deals, made small observations that made them feel like they were part of something important. I watched him from across the room for a few minutes before taking my seat. He was good at what he did. That had never been the question. The question was whether what he had built could carry what was coming next, and whether I had done enough to make sure it could. When he finally sat down at the head of the table, the room settled into that familiar rhythm. Introductions, summaries, final confirmations. No one looked at me. No one needed to. I wasn't part of the conversation, at least not visibly. As the documents were distributed, I felt that same quiet stillness I'd learned to recognize in the VA hospital. The moment before something reveals itself. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just inevitable. I didn't move. Didn't speak. Just waited. Because I knew what was in those pages. And I knew what would happen when someone finally saw it. The room didn't recover quickly. It didn't fall apart either. It just slowed. That's the only way I can describe it. After the lawyer said we needed to stop, people didn't panic. They didn't raise their voices or push back. These were experienced people, men and women who had seen deals shift, collapse, reform. They understood that sometimes the most important thing you could do was pause. But the pause carried weight, and it settled in the space between my father and me. He was the first to stand. Not abruptly, not in a way that would suggest he'd lost control. Just a deliberate movement, the kind that says, I'm still leading this room. Let's take 10 minutes, he said, his voice even. We'll reconvene after counsel has reviewed the issue. No one objected. That's another thing about power. It doesn't need to raise its voice. People gathered their papers. Quiet conversations resumed in low tones. Chairs slid back, footsteps softened against the carpet. The meeting dissolved into smaller pieces, each one trying to make sense of what had just happened without asking the wrong questions too loudly. I stayed seated. The lawyer approached me after a moment, holding the contract close to his chest like it had suddenly become something fragile. Ms. Carter, he said carefully, I'd like to go over a few details with you if that's all right. I nodded, of course. We stepped into a smaller conference room down the hall. He closed the door behind us, then placed the document on the table and opened it again, this time more slowly. I want to be very clear, he said, adjusting his glasses. I'm not making any assumptions. I just need to understand the structure. That's fair, I said. He tapped a section of the page. This entity here, Carter Logistics Holdings. You're listed as the beneficiary. Yes. And this entity holds a controlling interest in 2 of the regional supply partners tied into the main agreement. Yes. He looked up at me. These partners weren't originally part of your father's plan. No, I said, they weren't. He exhaled, leaning back slightly. When were these arrangements put in place? Over the past 18 months, I answered. He nodded slowly, processing that. And your father was not involved, I said. Another pause. He wasn't judging me, not yet. He was doing what good lawyers do, mapping the situation before deciding what it meant. This changes the balance of the deal, he said finally. It stabilizes it, I replied. He held my gaze for a moment longer, then gave a small, almost reluctant nod. It might. That was enough. We went back to the main room a few minutes later. My father was standing near the head of the table, speaking quietly with 2 investors. He stopped when we entered. The room settled again. Not completely, but enough. Do we have clarity? He asked the lawyer. Some, the lawyer said. We'll need to adjust the structure before proceeding. There are additional parties involved that weren't previously disclosed. My father's eyes flicked to me, then back to the lawyer. Define additional. The lawyer hesitated just slightly, then said, Your daughter, for one. No one spoke. It wasn't the kind of silence that comes from confusion. It was recognition. The kind that moves slowly through a room as people connect pieces they didn't know belonged together. My father didn't react immediately. He stepped back from the table just a fraction and looked at me again. Not as if he were seeing me for the first time, but as if he were seeing something he had missed. "Explain it," he said. The same words as before. But this time they carried something different. Not dismissal. Not impatience. Something closer to uncertainty. I didn't stand. Didn't move to the front of the room. I stayed where I was speaking from the same seat I had taken at the beginning. The original structure relied on projected capacity from 3 primary suppliers, I said. 2 of them can't sustain that volume long-term without delays. A few people exchanged glances. My father didn't look away. "I've worked with those networks," I continued. "Not at this scale, but in similar conditions. The issue isn't initial delivery, it's consistency over time." "You're saying my projections are wrong?" he said. "I'm saying they're optimistic," I replied. A faint shift of weight, a tightening of his jaw. He didn't like that word. I introduced additional partners I went on before he could respond. Smaller operations, but more reliable under pressure. They don't replace your suppliers, they support them. "And you did this without consulting me," he said. "Yes." The word landed cleanly. No explanation attached. No apology. Another silence. Longer this time. Because now it wasn't about the deal anymore. It was about us. "You went behind my back," he said. "I went around a problem," I answered. "That's not your decision to make. It became mine when the outcome depended on it." His expression hardened slightly. "Everything depends on outcomes," he said. "That doesn't give you the right to take control of something that isn't yours." There it was. Ownership. Authority. The lines he had always believed in. I understood them. I just didn't share them anymore. "I didn't take control," I said. "I added support." "You added yourself," he corrected. "Yes." The room felt smaller. More focused. Because now no one was pretending this was just about contracts. This was something else. Something older. "You should have come to me," he said. "I did," I replied quietly. That stopped him. Not completely, but enough. "You dismissed it," I added, more than once. A few heads lowered around the table. No one wanted to be part of that memory. My father didn't deny it. He didn't confirm it either. He just stood there looking at me as if weighing something he hadn't expected to consider. Finally, he exhaled. Slow. Measured. "What do you want?" he asked. It wasn't a challenge. It wasn't even defensive. It was direct. And for a moment, I didn't answer. Because the truth wasn't simple. "I want the deal to work," I said. He held my gaze. And after that, he asked. I thought about it. About everything that had led to this moment. About the years between us. About what could be said now and what couldn't. After that, I said we decide what comes next. Not together. Not apart. Just decide. He nodded once. Not agreement. Not acceptance. But something closer to understanding. And that was more than I had expected. The deal didn't collapse. It didn't surge forward either. It settled. That's the word I'd use for what happened in the weeks that followed. Everything found a slower, more deliberate pace. The kind you only get when people realize they've been moving too fast. The structure was adjusted, not dramatically, not in a way that would make headlines. Just enough. New clauses, additional oversight, quiet acknowledgments of partnerships that had already been in place but hadn't been fully understood. My role remained what it had been from the beginning, present, but not visible in the way most people would define it. That was intentional. I didn't need the recognition. Not anymore. My father didn't argue against the changes. That surprised some people. It surprised me too, if I'm being honest. But he also didn't comment on them publicly. He handled it the way he handled most things that required recalibration privately, efficiently, without drawing attention to the shift. We didn't speak much during that time. Not because there wasn't anything to say, but because neither of us rushed it. There's a difference between silence that avoids something and silence that gives it room. This was the second kind. A few weeks after the signing, he called. Not during business hours, not through an assistant. Directly. "I'm in town," he said. "Are you available?" It wasn't phrased as a request. But it wasn't a command either. "Yes," I said. "Where?" He paused for a moment as if considering something. "There's a place you used to go," he said. "Near the hospital." I knew the one. A small diner on the corner of a side street, the kind of place most people overlook unless they've been there before. Nothing polished, nothing impressive. Just steady. "I'll meet you there," I said. He was already seated when I arrived. A booth by the window, coffee in front of him untouched. He looked out of place in a way I'd never seen before, not uncomfortable exactly, but aware of the setting in a way that didn't come naturally to him. I slid into the seat across from him. For a moment neither of us spoke. A waitress came by, filled my cup without asking, and moved on. "Do you come here often?" he asked finally. "Sometimes," I said. "It's quiet." He nodded, glancing around. "It's different," he said. "Yes," I replied. Another pause. He picked up his coffee, then set it back down again without taking a sip. I reviewed everything he said. "I assumed you would." The structure, he continued, the partners, the adjustments. I waited. He looked at me then directly. "You were right about the vulnerabilities," he said. It wasn't easy for him to say that. I could hear it. But he said it anyway. "That's good," I answered. Not dismissive. Not triumphant. Just steady. He studied me for a moment as if expecting something more. A reaction. A shift. But there wasn't one. "You're not going to say anything else?" he asked. "About what?" "About being right." I almost smiled. "No," I said, "that wasn't the point." He leaned back slightly, considering that. Then what was he asked? I looked down at my coffee for a moment, watching the surface settle. "The outcome," I said, "making sure it holds." He nodded slowly. "I've spent most of my life building things that hold," he said. "I know. And I missed something this time." "Yes." Another quiet moment. Not tense. Just honest. "I should have listened to you," he said. It wasn't an apology. Not exactly. But it was closer than anything he had said before. I let that sit for a moment. Then I nodded. "Yes," I said, "you should have." He didn't argue. Didn't defend himself. He just accepted it. We sat there for a while after that, not talking much. The kind of quiet that doesn't need to be filled because it's doing something on its own. He asked a few questions about the smaller partners. Not as a test. Not to challenge. Just to understand. And I answered. Simply. Directly. The way I would have years ago if he had asked. When the check came, he reached for it automatically. I let him. Some habits don't need to be changed. We stood outside for a moment after we left the diner. The afternoon light was softer now, the street moving at that same steady pace I'd gotten used to. "This doesn't fix everything," he said. "I know," I replied. He looked at me, not searching this time, not calculating. Just looking. "But it's a start," he added. I considered that. Then nodded. "Yes," I said, "it is." We didn't hug. We didn't say anything that sounded like closure. He got into his car. I walked back toward mine. And that was enough. Because for the first time it didn't feel like we were standing on opposite sides of something. Just different places. I used to think being seen meant being understood. That if someone finally looked at you the right way, everything else would fall into place. But it doesn't work like that. Sometimes being seen is just the beginning. And understanding takes longer. If this story stayed with you even quietly, I hope you'll take a moment to share it with someone who might understand it too. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, you're always welcome to stay a little longer.